At my husband's will reading, my daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "Let's be honest, Helen has become a burden to everyone." The room went quiet after that. Not shocked quiet, careful quiet. The kind where nobody wants to look directly at you, because deep down, they know something cruel just happened. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let her keep talking. That was the moment everything changed. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it still amazes me how many people understand this kind of family pain without needing a single explanation." The lawyer's office smelled faintly alike old coffee and polished wood. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago looked gray and wet from the November rain. Cars moved slowly below us, while my entire life quietly unraveled on the 18th floor. 3 weeks earlier, I buried my husband, Richard Turner. 42 years of marriage reduced to a folded flag, sympathy casseroles, and silence filling a house that suddenly sounded too large. I still reached for him in my sleep sometimes. That morning, I had stood in my bedroom for nearly 20 minutes trying to choose what to wear to the will reading. It felt ridiculous afterward, but grief makes you cling to strange things. I finally chose a navy blue sweater Richard once bought me during a weekend trip to Vermont. "You look classy in blue," he'd said back then. I could still hear his voice when I closed my eyes.
Looking back now, that should have been my first warning. I was dressing for dignity while everyone else was preparing for division. My son Daniel picked me up at 10:30. He barely hugged me. "Morning, Mom," he muttered while checking something on his phone. That hurt more than I expected. Daniel used to hug me so tightly when he was little that I could barely breathe. Even as an adult, he had always kissed my forehead whenever he visited. But grief changes people. At least that's what I kept telling myself. His wife, Vanessa, sat in the passenger seat wearing oversized sunglasses, even though the sky was dark with rain clouds. "Hi, Helen," she said without turning around. Not Mom, not even Mrs. Turner, just Helen. Small things start adding up after a while. The drive downtown felt strangely formal. The heater hummed softly while Daniel tapped the steering wheel with nervous fingers. Vanessa kept checking her reflection in the side mirror. Nobody mentioned Richard. Nobody mentioned the funeral. Nobody mentioned the reason we were all together. At that moment, I still didn't understand what they were planning. When we arrived at the law office, Vanessa stepped out first, smoothing her beige wool coat before we even reached the elevator. She looked polished, calm, almost excited. That unsettled me more than anything. Who looks excited before a will reading? The receptionist offered bottled water and pointed us toward a large conference room overlooking the river. Everything inside looked expensive in a cold, careful way. Dark leather chairs, silver lamps, framed degrees on cream-colored walls. A tray of untouched pastry sat near the coffee machine. Vanessa took the seat closest to the lawyer before anyone else could sit down. I noticed that. I notice everything now. Richard's attorney, Martin Green, entered a few moments later carrying several thick folders against his chest. He looked tired, older than I remembered. "Mrs. Turner," he said softly, shaking my hand. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Unlike everyone else that morning, he actually sounded sincere. "Thank you, Martin." Daniel stayed near the window checking emails while Vanessa crossed one elegant leg over the other and glanced around the room like she already belonged there. I stayed quiet, and that made her even more confident. Martin began carefully explaining paperwork, assets, legal procedures. His voice blended with the rain tapping against the windows. Most of it barely registered in my mind. I kept staring at Richard's name printed across the folders. Richard A. Turner Estate. It looked so final, so impossible. 42 years together, and suddenly his entire existence had become documents clipped inside expensive binders. Then Vanessa sighed loudly. Not emotional, annoyed. "Can we simplify some of this?" she asked. "Helen gets overwhelmed by financial discussions." I looked up slowly. Martin paused. Daniel said nothing. That silence stayed with me. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing your child will sit quietly while someone disrespects you right in front of him. But I smiled politely. "Oh, I understand enough," I said. Vanessa smiled back immediately. Too quickly. Like she had prepared for resistance. "Well," she laughed lightly, "we just want what's easiest for everyone." Everyone. That word kept appearing all day. Not what Richard wanted, not what I needed. What was easiest for everyone. Another warning sign I ignored.
Martin continued reading through the estate details, while Vanessa occasionally interrupted with questions about timelines, property taxes, and account access. Very specific questions. Questions that sounded rehearsed. I watched Daniel carefully during all of it. He avoided eye contact every time she spoke. That frightened me more than her behavior. Because Vanessa had always been ambitious, opinionated, sharp around the edges. But Daniel used to protect me. When he was 10 years old, he punched a 7th grader for making fun of my old station wagon in the school pickup line. Now, he couldn't even look at me. The rain outside grew heavier. At one point, Martin mentioned the house. "Our understanding," he said carefully, "is that Mrs. Turner will remain in the family residence." Vanessa immediately leaned forward. "For now," she corrected gently. "For now." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. The house was mine and Richard's home for 36 years. We painted that kitchen ourselves. Daniel took his first steps in the living room beside the fireplace. Richard planted the maple tree in the front yard the summer he turned 40. For now? I folded my hands tighter in my lap. Martin cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, naturally, future arrangements can always be discussed as a family." Vanessa nodded slowly, like a woman already managing a situation. Then she looked directly at me. "You know, maintaining a large suburban house alone at your age can become exhausting." There it was. Not concern, positioning. The difference matters. I glanced toward Daniel, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he stared out the window at the rain sliding down the glass. And suddenly, for the first time since Richard died, I felt truly alone. Not widowed, outnumbered. Martin resumed reading. Investment accounts, retirement funds, insurance policies. Every number seemed to make Vanessa sit straighter. At one point, she even opened her phone calculator beneath the table. She thought nobody noticed. I noticed. Grief sharpened strange instincts. Then came the moment I still replay in my mind almost every night. Martin explained that some financial distributions would remain temporarily protected while legal reviews were completed. Vanessa's entire expression changed. Only for a second, but I saw it. A flicker of irritation, like someone hearing unexpected bad news. At that moment, I still didn't understand why, but part of me suddenly became very alert. Vanessa leaned back in her chair slowly, crossed her arms, and smiled. "Well," she said casually, "we all know this process can't drag on forever. Daniel and I already have enough responsibilities." Nobody answered. Then she laughed softly and added, "Let's be honest, Helen has become a burden to everyone." The room froze. Rain against the windows. Air vent humming overhead. A car horn somewhere far below. I remember every sound, except my own breathing. Martin looked horrified. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like he wanted the sentence to disappear after it had already landed. But nobody defended me. That's the part people never understand. The cruelty hurts, but the silence afterward hurts more. I looked down at my wedding ring. Richard used to twist his own ring whenever he was nervous during business meetings. I watched him do it for decades. My fingers suddenly missed him so badly, I thought my chest might split open right there in that leather chair. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply looked back at Vanessa and smiled faintly. "Go ahead," I said softly. "Finish what you were trying to say." Her confidence grew instantly. Cruel people become bolder when kindness stays quiet. "Well," she continued carefully, "we're just trying to think realistically. Daniel works nonstop. We have the kids, the mortgage, the business investment, and honestly," she shrugged, "it's becoming harder for everyone to balance things." Balance things. Interesting phrase. Like I was unpaid overtime. Martin interrupted gently. "I don't believe this discussion is appropriate right now." Vanessa waved a manicured hand dismissively. "No, Martin, it's important. Families need honest conversations." Daniel finally spoke. "Vanessa." But there was no strength behind it, no protection, just discomfort. And somehow that felt worse. I stayed quiet, and that made her even more confident. She leaned toward me slightly. "Nobody's saying you can't live independently," she said in that soft, controlled voice people use when they want to sound compassionate in public. "We just think maybe a smaller place would make more sense eventually." Smaller place. I knew exactly what that meant. An apartment. Senior living. Being managed. Being moved quietly out of the way. I suddenly remembered something strange Richard told me 6 months earlier while we sat on the back porch drinking iced tea. "If anything ever feels off after I'm gone," he'd said, "don't rush decisions." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Looking back now, I think he meant something else entirely. Martin shuffled papers nervously before sliding a folder toward me. "There are also temporary authorization forms if you'd prefer assistance handling certain accounts during probate." Vanessa immediately brightened. "There," she said quickly, "that's exactly the kind of thing we should simplify today." Today. Everything suddenly felt rushed. Too rushed. I picked up the papers slowly. Legal language filled every page. Temporary financial oversight. Shared authorization. Administrative access. The words blurred together for a moment. Then I noticed something strange. Daniel's signature line was already highlighted. My stomach tightened. At that moment, I still didn't fully understand what they were trying to do. But for the first time all morning, instinct screamed louder than grief. I set the papers down carefully. "I'd like copies to review at home first."
The room changed instantly. Tiny reactions, tiny tells. Vanessa blinked twice. Daniel shifted in his seat. Martin looked relieved. And suddenly, I knew something important without understanding the full picture yet. They expected me to sign immediately. Vanessa recovered first. "Well, of course," she said, though her smile looked thinner now. "We just thought it would save time." Save time. Another interesting phrase. I gathered my purse slowly while Martin prepared copies. Nobody spoke much after that. The atmosphere had changed. The rain outside finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked gray and silver. As we stood to leave, I noticed Vanessa whisper something sharply to Daniel near the doorway. He looked frustrated, cornered. Then both of them suddenly stopped talking when I approached. That was not grief. That was strategy. And for the first time since Richard's death, fear quietly gave way to something else. Attention. Real attention. When Daniel drove me home, Vanessa stayed unusually silent. No fake concern, no small talk, just tension filling the SUV like smoke. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed my porch light glowing against the dark afternoon sky. Home. My home. For now, apparently. Daniel finally looked at me before I got out of the car. "You know Vanessa means well," he said quietly. I studied my son's face. The little boy I raised still existed somewhere behind the exhaustion and guilt, but something had changed around him, something manipulative, something patient. I smiled softly and reached for the door handle. I'm sure she does. But that night, after they left, I sat alone in Richard's recliner staring at those papers spread across the coffee table. And buried deep inside the final page, I found one sentence that made my blood run cold. Because suddenly I realized this wasn't only about helping me, it was about control. And someone had already been planning this far longer than I ever imagined. The sentence at the bottom of the page was only 12 words long, but it changed the entire feeling of my living room. Temporary co-residential transition may be recommended pending financial review. I read it 3 times before setting the papers down. Outside, rainwater still dripped from the maple tree beside the porch. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily through the silence. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes groaned softly, the way they always did during cold weather. Home usually comforted me. That night, it felt unfamiliar. I sat alone in Richard's recliner with the lamp on beside me and stared at those papers until my eyes burned. Co-residential transition. Such careful language. Not moving, not leaving, not losing your home. Just words polished enough to sound reasonable. That frightened me more than open cruelty would have. I folded the papers slowly and placed them back inside the envelope. Then I looked around the living room. Richard's reading glasses still rested beside his chair. His crossword puzzle remained unfinished on the coffee table. A navy blue blanket still hung over the sofa where he used to nap during football games, every Sunday afternoon. 42 years of life surrounded me in that room, and suddenly, I had the strange feeling someone was quietly measuring it for removal. At that moment, I still didn't know how long this had been happening behind my back. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house felt louder after midnight. The refrigerator humming, tree branches scratching lightly against the gutters, the heater clicking on and off. Grief already makes a house feel hollow. Suspicion makes it worse. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs and made chamomile tea I didn't really want. I stood barefoot in the kitchen staring out into the dark backyard, while steam rose from the mug between my hands. Richard built that deck himself. Daniel helped him paint it when he was 14. I could still picture them arguing over measurements while classic rock played from the garage radio. Back then, family felt permanent. Now everything felt conditional. I stayed in the kitchen until almost dawn, and somewhere between exhaustion and silence, a thought quietly entered my mind for the first time. What if Richard already knew something was wrong? The next morning, sunlight broke weakly through gray clouds over our subdivision. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. Dog walkers, school buses, Christmas decorations beginning to appear on porches, even though Thanksgiving was still weeks away. Normal life continuing while mine slowly shifted underneath me. I forced myself into routine. Coffee, toast, morning news playing too softly from the television. But grief had changed routine into performance. Every action now felt deliberate, measured, lonely. Around 9:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Hello? A man cleared his throat on the other end. Mrs. Turner? Yes? This is Paul Simmons. I worked with Richard for years. His voice sounded cautious, older, careful in the way people sound when they're calling about something uncomfortable. I immediately sat straighter in my chair. Paul Simmons had been Richard's accountant for nearly 2 decades before semi-retiring last year. Quiet man, very formal. The kind who always wore dark suits, even to backyard barbecues. I'm sorry to bother you, he said softly. I know this is a difficult time. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. You're not bothering me. There was a pause. Then another, like he was deciding whether to continue. I was hoping we could meet privately, he finally said. Privately. That word changed the air in the room. I glanced instinctively toward the front windows, even though nobody was outside. About what exactly? Another pause. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. At that moment, I still didn't understand why Richard's former accountant sounded nervous speaking to his widow. We agreed to meet later that afternoon at a small diner near the lake about 20 minutes from my neighborhood. After hanging up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for several seconds. Then my phone buzzed again. Vanessa. I stared at her name lighting up the screen. Something about the timing unsettled me immediately. Hi, Vanessa. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Good morning, Helen. Just checking in. Checking in. Interesting phrase. Nobody had checked on me much since the funeral, unless paperwork was involved. That's thoughtful, I said carefully. We're all worried about you, she continued smoothly. You've been alone a lot. I looked around my kitchen slowly. The family photographs, the ceramic bowl Richard brought back from Santa Fe, the curtains I sewed myself 20 years ago. Alone. Funny how people only start emphasizing your loneliness when they want you moved somewhere else. I'm doing all right. Well, she said lightly, Daniel and I were actually talking last night. We think maybe you shouldn't be handling too much financial stress right now. There it was again. Financial stress, not grief, not healing, money, paperwork, control. I stayed quiet, and that made her continue. We just don't want anyone taking advantage of you during this vulnerable period. That almost made me laugh, because something deep inside me had already started whispering the opposite possibility. Maybe someone already was. I appreciate the concern, I said calmly. Another brief silence. Then her tone shifted slightly, barely noticeable. But you should really think carefully about those documents Martin prepared. My eyes moved toward the envelope still sitting on the kitchen counter. I'm reviewing everything. Well, she said slowly, these things move faster when families cooperate. Families cooperate. Another polished sentence hiding pressure underneath. Looking back now, that should have been my second warning. After we hung up, I noticed my hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, from clarity. Small pieces were beginning to connect, though I still couldn't see the entire picture yet. At noon, I drove to the diner near Lake Kensington. The sky hung low and silver above the water. Cold wind pushed dead leaves across the parking lot, while old Christmas songs played faintly through outdoor speakers near the entrance. Inside, the diner smelled like baking grease and burnt coffee. Comforting smells. American smells. The kind Richard always loved. Paul Simmons sat alone in a booth near the back, wearing a charcoal overcoat neatly folded beside him. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. When he stood to greet me, his expression immediately softened. Helen. Nobody had called me Helen with genuine warmth in weeks. We ordered coffee first. Neither of us touched the menus. Paul kept adjusting his napkin carefully while people chatted quietly around us. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered against metal trays. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. How are you holding up? People ask that question after funerals the same way cashiers ask how your day is going. Most don't actually want the answer. But Paul did. I'm surviving.
He nodded slowly, then his eyes moved briefly toward the windows before returning to me. That's partly why I asked to meet privately. There it was again, privately. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Strange how suspicion eventually becomes calm. What's going on, Paul? He exhaled carefully. Richard contacted me about 6 months ago. 6 months. Before the hospital? Before hospice? Before the funeral? A cold feeling moved quietly through my chest. He asked me to review several financial structures tied to the estate. I frowned slightly. Why? Paul hesitated long enough to answer the question without words. He had concerns. Concerns? About what? I waited. Paul stirred cream into his coffee, even though he never used cream before. I remembered that oddly enough. Richard used to tease him about drinking coffee like motor oil. Now his hands looked unsteady. Helen? He said quietly. Did Richard ever mention disagreements involving Vanessa? My stomach tightened immediately. No. Another pause. Then he asked something even stranger. Did he ever mention changing certain account protections? Protections. That word landed differently than everything else. Not arrangements. Not planning. Protections. Suddenly, the diner noise around us faded into background static. At that moment, I realized this conversation had very little to do with grief. Paul lowered his voice slightly. There were several unusual conversations during Richard's final months. Unusual how? He became concerned about pressure. Pressure. My mind immediately flashed back to Vanessa sitting confidently beside the lawyer yesterday, the highlighted signature line, the rehearsed questions, the rushed documents. I suddenly felt very cold despite the warm diner. Paul looked genuinely uncomfortable now. I debated whether to involve myself, he admitted, but after yesterday's meeting. I stared at him. How do you know about yesterday? His expression shifted suddenly. I was contacted afterward. By who? The question formed instantly in my mind, but before I could ask, Paul continued. Helen? Has anyone discussed assisted living with you yet? The air left my lungs slowly, not directly, not openly. But suddenly dozens of small comments replayed themselves in my head all at once. You shouldn't be alone so much. This house is a lot for someone your age. You need less stress. Families cooperate. I sat back against the booth carefully. Outside, waves moved darkly across the lake beneath the gray afternoon sky. Paul studied me for several long seconds. Then he reached slowly into his leather briefcase. What he removed wasn't a folder. It wasn't paperwork. It was worse. A photocopy. One single page. Folded carefully down the middle. I think you need to see this, he said quietly. My fingers felt strangely numb as I took it from him. At first, I only recognized Daniel's handwriting. Then I saw Vanessa's notes scribbled in blue ink near the margins. And halfway down the page, I saw my own address beside 3 words that made my blood run cold. Projected liquidation timeline.
I looked up at Paul slowly. The diner suddenly sounded very far away, and in that moment, for the very first time, I realized they weren't just planning around my grief. They were planning around my removal. I stared at the words projected liquidation timeline so long that the letters stopped looking real. The diner around me kept moving normally, waitresses balancing coffee pots, forks clinking against ceramic plates, an older couple sharing pancakes near the windows. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of my family quietly shifted beneath my feet. I looked back up at Paul. What exactly am I looking at? His expression tightened immediately, not because he didn't know, because he did, and he clearly regretted knowing it. Paul lowered his voice even further.
That document came from a preliminary estate discussion. Between who? He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything before he even answered. Vanessa requested financial projections several months ago. Several months ago. Not after Richard died. Before. A strange calm spread through me then. Not denial, not panic. Recognition. Tiny moments from the past year suddenly started rearranging themselves in my mind, like puzzle pieces finally turning the correct direction. Vanessa asking unusually detailed questions about property taxes during Easter dinner, Daniel casually mentioning home equity over Thanksgiving, Richard growing quieter every time financial topics came up. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now I wondered if it was disappointment or fear. Paul carefully folded his hands together. "Helen, I need you to understand something." I nodded slowly. These discussions began before Richard entered hospice. The air inside the diner suddenly felt thinner. Outside, cold wind rippled across the dark lake water, while gray clouds pressed low over the shoreline. Before hospice, before we even knew how little time remained. I swallowed carefully. Did Richard know? Paul looked at me for a long moment. Then he answered in the gentlest voice possible. Yes. That single word hurt more than Vanessa's insult ever could, because it meant Richard carried this knowledge alone while he was dying, and somehow he tried to shield me from it. I looked down at the photocopied page again. My address, financial projections, notes in Vanessa's handwriting, cold, organized planning disguised as concern. At that moment, I realized something painful. People rarely reveal themselves all at once. They do it slowly, politely, one small comment at a time. I remembered a barbecue last summer. Daniel had been grilling burgers while the grandchildren played tag in the backyard. Vanessa stood beside me on the patio, sipping white wine from one of my crystal glasses. "You know," she'd said casually, "houses this size become dangerous for seniors eventually." At the time, she smiled afterward, touched my arm gently, made it sound caring. Now I heard the sentence differently. Not concern, assessment. Looking back now, that should have been another warning.
Paul slid the photocopy back into his briefcase carefully. "There's more." Those two words immediately tightened every muscle in my body. "How much more?" He glanced toward the diner entrance first, like he was checking whether someone might walk in unexpectedly. That unsettled me more than the paperwork itself. Vanessa requested several meetings over the past year. "With you?" "Not only me." A pause. "She also met privately with Martin Green, Richard's attorney, the same man sitting awkwardly at the will reading yesterday." Suddenly, his discomfort made much more sense. I stayed very still. "When?" "Multiple times." "Did Daniel know?" Paul's silence answered before his mouth did. "I believe so." "Believe so, not definitely." That distinction mattered, because part of me still desperately wanted to believe my son wasn't fully involved. Grief makes mothers bargain with reality long after logic disappears. Paul continued carefully. "At first, the meeting sounded routine. Estate planning, tax efficiency, trust management." Then he stopped speaking. I waited. Finally, he sighed. But eventually, the conversations shifted. Shifted how? Another hesitation. Then, they became increasingly focused on transitional scenarios. Transitional scenarios, again with the polished language. Nobody ever says the ugly thing directly. They wrap it in legal wording until cruelty sounds practical. What kind of transitions? Paul looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Housing arrangements? Asset access? Medical authority. Medical authority. That phrase sent something cold through my chest, because suddenly I remembered another moment. 3 months ago, Richard asleep upstairs after chemotherapy. Vanessa standing in my kitchen while loading the dishwasher. "Have you and Richard updated your medical directives recently?" she asked casually. I barely looked up from drying plates. "No? Why?"
"Oh, no reason," she said brightly. "It's just important once people get older." People get older. Funny how often she used age like a quiet weapon. Not openly cruel. Never openly cruel. That's what made it harder to explain. Manipulative people rarely scream first. They soften the ground. Little by little. I stared at my untouched coffee. It had gone cold. How involved was Daniel? Paul's jaw tightened slightly. I honestly don't know. That answer felt honest, which somehow hurt more. Because uncertainty leaves room for hope. And hope can become its own kind of torture. Outside, snow flurries had begun mixing with rain over the lake. Early winter arriving quietly. I suddenly realized Richard wasn't here to study any of this anymore. No deep voice telling me everything would be okay. No warm hand squeezing mine beneath the dinner table. Just me. And whatever had been happening around us while I was busy trying to keep him alive. At that moment, I still didn't understand how deep the situation actually went. Paul reached into his briefcase again. This time he removed a legal notepad filled with handwritten dates. I made copies for myself after certain meetings started concerning me.
Concerning him, that word landed heavily, because accountants do not scare easily. I leaned closer. Several entries listed dates beside initials. VG, MG, DT. Vanessa Green, Martin Green, Daniel Turner. Meeting after meeting after meeting, some stretching back nearly 11 months. 11 months. Richard had still been driving then, still mowing the lawn himself, still pretending chemotherapy wasn't exhausting him. My chest tightened painfully. They had been discussing my future while Richard was still alive enough to overhear them from the next room. I pressed my fingers lightly against my wedding ring. What exactly were they planning? Paul looked toward the windows again before answering. I don't think the original intention was malicious. Original intention, meaning it changed. Then what happened? He lowered his voice. Money changes dynamics inside families. That sentence sat heavily between us, because we both knew he wasn't only talking about money anymore. He was talking about power, control, access. I thought about Vanessa's face during the will reading, how quickly disappointment flashed across her expression when Martin mentioned protected distributions. She wasn't grieving yesterday. She was calculating. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. Richard sitting alone on the back porch one evening last spring. Quiet, distant. I brought him iced tea and asked what was wrong. "Do you trust people too easily, Helen?" he asked suddenly. I laughed softly back then. What kind of question is that? But he never answered. He just stared out at the yard for a very long time. At the time, I assumed he was afraid of dying. Now I wondered if he was afraid of leaving me behind with people he no longer fully trusted. The realization nearly broke me, but I stayed composed. That surprised even me. Maybe survival eventually becomes colder than sadness. Paul leaned back slowly. "There's one more thing you should know." Every time someone said those words lately, my world seemed to shrink further. "What?" His expression changed again. This time not nervous, reluctant. "Helen, Richard asked me to delay certain disclosures if anything happened to him." I frowned immediately. "What disclosures?" He believed pressure might increase after his death. Pressure. Again that word. I felt my pulse slow unnaturally. Richard knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to prepare quietly. Enough to worry. Enough to leave instructions behind. Suddenly the room felt emotionally upside down. For weeks I thought I had lost the one person protecting me. Now I was beginning to understand he might still be protecting me somehow. Even after death. "How much did he tell you?" Paul hesitated carefully. "Not enough." Another unfinished answer. Another partial truth. Retention lived inside uncertainty, and everyone around me suddenly seemed filled with fragments instead of full explanations. I left the diner just before sunset. The cold air outside stung my cheeks immediately when wind pushed dead leaves across the parking lot. I sat inside my car for nearly 10 minutes without starting the engine, just thinking, replaying, recalculating memories. Vanessa's comments, Daniel's silence, Richard's strained warnings. Tiny things that once seemed harmless now looked deliberate,
And the most frightening part? I still suspected I only understood half of it. When I finally pulled into my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. Not dramatic, subtle, but wrong. Daniel's SUV sat parked near the curb. My stomach tightened instantly. The house lights were on downstairs. I never left lights on. At that moment, I still didn't know they had used the spare key. I walked toward the front porch slowly. Voices drifted faintly through the house. Daniel, Vanessa, and another voice I recognized almost immediately. Martin Green, the lawyer. My pulse dropped into an eerie calm. Nobody knew I was outside yet. I stepped closer to the front window, and then I heard Vanessa say something that made my blood run cold. If Helen refuses to cooperate, we may need to accelerate the transition. I froze completely, inside my own house, listening to strangers discuss my life like a scheduling inconvenience. Then Martin answered quietly, and what he said next changed everything. Richard anticipated that possibility before he died.
I stood frozen beside my own front window while cold wind pushed against my coat. Inside the house, my son sat at my kitchen table, my daughter-in-law sat beside him, and my husband's attorney stood near the counter, holding a folder against his chest. The warm yellow kitchen light spilled across hardwood floors Richard and I refinished together 15 years ago. For one strange second, the scene almost looked normal. Family gathered at the table, voices low, coffee mugs out. Except they weren't waiting for me. They were discussing me. If Helen refuses to cooperate, we may need to accelerate the transition. Vanessa's voice stayed calm when she said it, professional almost, like she was discussing real estate paperwork instead of a human life. Then Martin Green answered quietly. Richard anticipated that possibility before he died. Every muscle in my body tightened. The wind rattled the dead leaves near the porch steps, while my heart suddenly felt unnaturally still. Richard anticipated that possibility, meaning he knew. Not vaguely, not emotionally, specifically. At that moment, I realized my husband had been fighting a battle beside me long before I ever noticed one existed. I stepped closer to the window carefully. Inside, Daniel rubbed both hands over his face, exhausted, tense, older than 43. "I still think we should slow down," he muttered. Vanessa immediately turned toward him. "We've already slowed down." That sentence landed harder than she intended, because people only say things like that when conversations have already been happening privately for a long time. Martin shifted uncomfortably near the counter. "The issue isn't whether Helen stays temporarily," he said carefully. "The issue is legal exposure if certain provisions become activated." Activated. Another polished, legal word hiding danger underneath. Daniel looked up sharply. "What exactly does that mean?" Martin hesitated. That hesitation told me two things immediately. First, Daniel did not know everything. Second, Vanessa probably knew more than he did. I stayed perfectly still outside the window. Rainwater dripped from the gutters beside me, while the cold slowly crept through my clothes. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling like prey. I started listening strategically. Inside, Vanessa leaned forward. "Martin, with all due respect, Richard was emotional near the end." Emotional. That word almost made me laugh out loud. My husband built a manufacturing company from nothing, worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years, negotiated million-dollar contracts without raising his voice once. Richard Turner was many things. Emotional was never one of them. Martin's expression tightened. Richard was very clear-minded when these documents were prepared. Documents, plural. Not document. Documents. Another piece quietly slid into place inside my mind. Daniel looked between them slowly. "What documents?" Vanessa answered too quickly. "Nothing dramatic." That was the first openly nervous thing I'd seen from her all week. Small, fast, but nervous. Martin remained silent, and silence reveals more than arguments ever do. At that moment, I understood something important. Vanessa had information she was trying to control carefully, but Martin was becoming uncomfortable carrying it. Inside the kitchen, Daniel stood and walked toward the sink. The movement looked restless, cornered. "I just don't understand why Dad suddenly changed things near the end," he said quietly. "Changed things." My stomach tightened again. Richard changed something before he died, something important enough that Vanessa was now visibly frustrated. Outside, snow began mixing with freezing rain around me.
Tiny icy drops collected against my coat collar while I listened from the shadows beside my own porch. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Because hospice patients get paranoid," she snapped softly. That sentence changed everything for me. Not because of the cruelty, because of the disrespect. You cannot fake love once contempt enters your voice. Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately. "Vanessa." "No, seriously," she continued. "Your father spent months obsessing over hypothetical scenarios." Hypothetical. Interesting choice of word, because people rarely prepare legal protections against imaginary problems. Martin cleared his throat carefully. Richard believed Helen might face pressure after his passing. Pressure. There was that word again. It followed every conversation like smoke. Daniel leaned against the counter quietly, and suddenly I saw it clearly for the first time. My son looked less like a co-conspirator and more like a man caught inside something he no longer fully controlled. That realization hurt in an entirely different way, because manipulation inside families rarely happens cleanly. Sometimes people slide into betrayal one compromise at a time, one signature, one discussion, one rationalization, until eventually they no longer recognize themselves. I remembered another strange moment from earlier that year. Richard sitting at the dining room table late one night reviewing papers after everyone left Easter dinner. I walked in wearing my robe and smiled. "You're working too hard again." He looked up slowly, not angry, not stressed, just tired in a deeper way. "Helen," he asked quietly, "if something ever felt wrong, would you trust your instincts?" At the time, I laughed softly. "What kind of question is that?" He smiled after that, but it wasn't a peaceful smile. Now, standing outside in the freezing dark, I finally understood what he had been trying to say. He knew something was shifting around us, and he couldn't figure out how to warn me without destroying the family before he died.
Inside, Vanessa stood abruptly and walked toward the living room. I ducked slightly beside the window instinctively. Her heels clicked sharply across hardwood floors. Impatient, controlled, dangerous in the way ambitious people become dangerous when timelines change unexpectedly. She stopped near Richard's recliner, his chair, still positioned beside the lamp, exactly where he left it. "I'm telling you right now," she said coldly, "this gets much harder if Helen starts asking questions." Questions. Not grief counseling, not healing. Questions. Daniel looked exhausted. "She's my mother." Vanessa spun toward him immediately. "And she's vulnerable, Daniel. That's exactly why we need structure in place now." Structure. Another careful word hiding control underneath. Martin stayed silent again. That silence kept bothering me, because attorneys do not stay quiet unless they're protecting something, or regretting something. Outside, my fingers had gone numb from cold, but I couldn't leave. Not now. Not while pieces of my marriage and family were quietly exposing themselves room by room inside that house. Then Daniel asked the question that changed the entire atmosphere. "What exactly did Dad put into those documents?" The kitchen went silent. Even through the glass, I felt it immediately. Vanessa looked toward Martin. Martin looked down at the folder. Nobody answered quickly enough. And delayed answers are answers. Finally, Martin spoke carefully. Richard established conditional protections tied to estate access. Conditional protections. Daniel frowned. "What does that mean in plain English?" Martin exhaled slowly. "It means certain inheritance distributions can be suspended under specific circumstances." My pulse slowed. Suspended. Vanessa's face hardened instantly. "There it is," she muttered. Not surprise, recognition. She already knew. That confirmed it immediately. Daniel stared between them. "What circumstances?" Martin hesitated again. Then, evidence of coercion, financial manipulation, undue pressure against Helen. The room went completely still. Even outside in the dark, I felt the weight of those words hit my son. Because suddenly this wasn't emotional family tension anymore. It was legal. Richard had anticipated manipulation specifically enough to write protections against it into the estate itself. My husband knew. He knew. And instead of confronting everyone directly, he quietly prepared. The realization nearly broke my heart. Not because he doubted them, because he doubted them while dying and still tried to preserve peace.
Inside, Vanessa folded her arms tightly. "This is ridiculous." But her voice sounded thinner now, less confident. Martin spoke carefully. Richard documented concerns during the final revisions. Documented concerns. Daniel slowly sat back down at the kitchen table. What concerns? Nobody answered immediately.
Then Martin did something unexpected. He opened the folder. Even from outside the window, I saw Vanessa tense instantly. That reaction alone terrified me. Martin removed several pages carefully. I shouldn't even be discussing this without Helen present. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. She doesn't need unnecessary stress right now. There it was again. Stress. The universal excuse people use before taking control from someone else. Martin ignored her this time. Richard specifically instructed me to preserve copies independently. Independently, meaning he trusted nobody fully by the end, not even his own attorney. Daniel's voice dropped lower. What exactly did Dad say? Martin looked directly at him. Then he answered quietly. He believed someone close to Helen was positioning her to lose financial autonomy after his death. I stopped breathing for a second, because suddenly every strange conversation from the past year replayed at once. The housing comments, the paperwork pressure, the medical authority discussions, the subtle isolation. None of it was random. It was preparation. Vanessa looked furious now. This is becoming absurd. But nobody agreed with her. And for the first time all week, I saw fear enter her face. Real fear. That changed the emotional balance instantly. Daniel looked pale. When did Dad say this? Martin hesitated. Then he removed one final paper from the folder, different from the others, older, handwritten. Even through the window, I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately. My chest tightened so hard it physically hurt. Martin looked down at the page carefully. This was written 6 days before Richard entered hospice. Vanessa stepped forward sharply. Martin, but he kept speaking. He instructed me not to release it unless Helen's position became threatened after his death. Threatened. My own husband anticipated this exact situation. Tears finally burned behind my eyes for the first time all evening. Not from humiliation, from heartbreak. Because Richard spent his final weeks trying to protect me quietly, while I sat beside his hospital bed believing the only thing killing him was cancer.
Inside, Daniel whispered, "What's in the letter?" Martin looked down at the paper, then slowly answered, "A warning." The room fell silent again. And then, Martin unfolded the handwritten page. I pressed closer to the cold glass instinctively, because at the very top, above Richard's signature, I saw my own name, and underneath it, one sentence that made my entire body go cold. If you are reading this, Helen, it means I was right about someone in our family. The moment I saw Richard's handwriting, my knees almost gave out beneath me. 42 years of marriage teaches you the shape of someone's pen strokes, the same way you learn their breathing at night. Even through cold glass and dim kitchen light, I knew it instantly. Inside the house, nobody moved. Martin held the folded letter carefully in both hands, while Daniel stared at it like he was afraid to hear what came next. Vanessa looked different now, not confident, not polished, tight, controlled in the dangerous way people become controlled when they realize a situation is slipping beyond them. And somehow that frightened me more than her insults ever had. If you are reading this, Helen, it means I was right about someone in our family. The words echoed silently through my head before Martin even read the rest aloud, because suddenly Richard no longer felt gone. He felt present, watching, still protecting me from somewhere just beyond the walls of that kitchen. I stepped closer to the window without realizing it. Cold rain soaked through my coat sleeves while my fingers trembled against the siding beside the porch. Inside, Daniel finally spoke. What the hell does that mean? His voice cracked slightly at the end. That cracked mattered, because for the first time all week, my son sounded less defensive and more afraid. Martin unfolded the second page slowly. I haven't read this aloud before, he admitted quietly. Vanessa immediately interrupted. Maybe we shouldn't do this tonight. Too fast. Too urgent. That reaction alone told me the letter threatened something important.
Martin ignored her. And that was new too. Until now, everyone in that kitchen had been orbiting Vanessa's emotional gravity. Suddenly, Martin wasn't. He adjusted his glasses carefully. Then he started reading. Helen, Richard wrote, if this letter has been opened, it means circumstances forced Martin's hand. I prayed that would never happen.
My chest tightened so sharply, I had to steady myself against the porch railing. That sounded exactly like him. Practical, even while heartbroken. Measured, even while dying. Inside, Daniel slowly sat back down. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. Nobody interrupted again. Richard's words filled the kitchen softly through the thin crack near the window frame. I did not want your final memories of our family poisoned by suspicion, but over the last year, I began noticing conversations that disturbed me. Conversations, plural, not one misunderstanding, not one emotional argument. Patterns, long-term patterns. Martin continued reading carefully. At first, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Grief from illness changes perspective, but eventually certain behaviors became impossible to ignore. I closed my eyes briefly, because I remembered those final months differently. Hospital visits, medication schedules, trying to keep Richard comfortable, trying not to let him see how terrified I was. Meanwhile, all along, he was quietly watching everyone else, protecting me silently while I focused entirely on protecting him. That realization hurt in a completely different way than grief. It felt lonely. Inside, Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. What behaviors? Martin hesitated. Then he kept reading. Repeated discussions about Helen's future living arrangements before my condition significantly worsened. Daniel's head lifted immediately. Vanessa looked furious now. Richard misunderstood things, she snapped. Martin stopped reading. The silence afterward stretched heavily through the kitchen. And for the first time, Daniel didn't immediately defend her. That shift was small, but emotionally enormous. Richard's voice continued through Martin. I also observed increasing interest regarding trust access, property authority, and medical decision structures. Authority, structures, trust access. Every sentence sounded less like paranoia and more like documentation. Vanessa shook her head sharply. This is unbelievable. But nobody looked at her. Not even Daniel. That shifted the emotional balance again. Slowly, quietly, like ice cracking underneath someone's feet. I stayed outside listening while freezing rain collected in my hair, and somewhere deep inside me, something hardened. Not bitterness, not revenge. Awareness. There's a moment in betrayal when grief stops being passive, when pain becomes observation. I think mine happened standing beside that window. Martin turned another page carefully. Then his voice lowered. Helen trusts people deeply. That kindness is one of the reasons I love her. It is also why I worry she may ignore warning signs long after I am gone. I pressed my hand against my mouth immediately, because Richard used to say that exact thing during arguments about contractors, salesmen, neighbors. You always assume the best first. He said it with affection, but now, inside this letter, it sounded like fear. Daniel looked devastated, actually devastated. His eyes stayed fixed on the table while Martin read, and suddenly I realized something important. This letter was not only exposing Vanessa, it was exposing Daniel's silence. And silence becomes unbearable when someone finally names it aloud. Martin continued carefully. I specifically instructed additional estate protections after noticing accelerated discussions regarding Helen's dependents. Dependents. Again, that word wrapped in concern. Vanessa suddenly stood. That's enough. But Martin kept reading. I do not believe everyone involved acted with malicious intent initially. However, influence changes people slowly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That line hit him hardest, because deep down, I think he knew it was true. Influence changes people slowly. Nobody wakes up one morning planning betrayal. It happens in increments: pressure, convenience, rationalization. Then one day you realize compassion disappeared somewhere along the way. I remembered another moment suddenly. Last winter, Richard asleep upstairs after treatment.
Daniel sitting at our kitchen island while Vanessa talked excitedly about expanding their investment property portfolio. At one point she laughed and said, "Well, eventually this house will become available too." Daniel smiled awkwardly afterward, but Richard didn't smile at all. I noticed it at the time, then buried it under everything else we were surviving. Looking back now, that should have terrified me. Inside, Vanessa started pacing. "This is manipulation," she said sharply. "Richard was sick." Martin finally looked directly at her. No, Richard was careful. That sentence changed the room again, because Martin no longer sounded uncertain. He sounded loyal. To Richard, not Vanessa, not Daniel. Richard. Daniel stared at Martin slowly. What else did Dad say? Another dangerous silence followed. Then Martin unfolded the final page, and suddenly Vanessa looked genuinely afraid. Real fear changes people physically. Her posture tightened, her breathing shortened. Even from outside the house, I could see it clearly. Martin read carefully. "If pressure against Helen increases after my passing, Martin has authorization to activate secondary trust protections immediately." Secondary trust protections. The phrase hit the room like broken glass. Daniel frowned. "What protections?" Vanessa answered before Martin could. "Richard overreacted and created unnecessary complications." Complications. Interesting word. People only call protections complications when those protections interfere with their plans. Martin ignored her completely now. Richard transferred several controlling interests into restricted trust management.
I stopped breathing. Transferred several controlling interests. Daniel looked stunned. "What are you talking about?" Martin lowered the paper slowly. "Your father legally restructured major assets 6 months ago." Vanessa's face drained of color instantly. That reaction told me something critical. She did not know the full extent either. Until that moment, she believed she understood the estate. Now she realized Richard had hidden something successfully. For the first time all night, I almost smiled. Not from satisfaction, from recognition. Richard never stopped protecting me, even while dying. Daniel stood abruptly. "What assets?" Martin looked toward the folder beside him, then answered quietly. "The company shares, certain investment holdings, and the property trust." Property trust. My house. The manufacturing company Richard built. Everything suddenly shifted direction emotionally, because this was no longer only about moving me. It was about control over something much larger. Vanessa stepped forward sharply. "That's impossible." Martin's expression stayed calm. "It's already finalized." Silence exploded through the kitchen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I saw Vanessa lose control completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, but emotionally. Her polished composure cracked around the edges. "How much control?" she asked quietly. That question revealed everything. Not why, not how could he. Control. That was the word she cared about most. Daniel stared at her slowly after she said it, and I watched realization begin entering my son's face piece by piece. Painful realization. The kind that changes relationships permanently. Martin answered carefully. "Enough that no major decisions regarding Helen's residence, care, or financial position can occur without specific authorization." Vanessa whispered something under her breath. Daniel looked sick. Then Martin said the sentence that changed the entire story. "There's also one more condition." Every person in the kitchen froze again. Even outside in the rain, I felt it immediately. Martin reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope marked with my name. Helen Turner. Handwritten by Richard. "If evidence of coercion, manipulation, or financial pressure against Helen emerges," Martin began slowly, "all suspended controlling interests transfer automatically to the alternate beneficiary." Alternate beneficiary. My pulse slammed hard against my ribs, because suddenly this wasn't just protection anymore. It was succession. Replacement. Daniel stared blankly. Alternate beneficiary? Vanessa looked almost panicked now. "Who?" Martin looked down at the sealed envelope, then finally answered. "Richard changed the inheritance structure shortly before entering hospice." The kitchen went completely silent.
And then Martin said the one name neither Daniel nor Vanessa expected to hear. Michael. My grandson. Not my son. My grandson.
Michael. The name hit the kitchen like shattered glass. Even outside in the freezing rain, I felt the emotional shift immediately. Daniel looked completely stunned. Vanessa looked furious. And Martin Green suddenly looked like a man who regretted being the only person in the room holding the full truth. Michael. Not my son, not the woman who called me a burden. Michael. For one strange second, the grief inside me stepped aside for something else entirely. Relief. Because Richard had seen someone worth trusting before he died. Inside the house, Daniel stared blankly across the kitchen table. What do you mean, Michael? Martin folded Richard's letter carefully before answering. Richard amended the trust structure approximately 6 weeks before entering hospice. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. That doesn't make sense. Interesting choice of words. Not, that's unfair. Not, why would he do that? Just, that doesn't make sense. Because to her, inheritance was mathematics, expected outcomes, control structures, not emotions, not loyalty. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. My son doesn't know anything about this. Martin looked at him carefully. He knows more than you think. That sentence changed the room again, and suddenly I realized something important. Michael had been carrying pieces of this story alone. I stayed outside another minute listening while rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof onto my shoulders. Then Vanessa said something that finally made me move. We need to talk to Michael before Helen does. Need, not should. Need. That wasn't concern. That was damage control. I stepped quietly away from the window before anyone inside noticed me. My shoes crunched softly over wet leaves as I moved toward the driveway. My hands no longer trembled from cold. They trembled from clarity. Because somewhere between the funeral and tonight, I had stopped being the confused widow everyone expected. Now I was observing, listening, remembering, and people become dangerous to manipulators the moment they stop reacting emotionally. I drove slowly through the neighborhood afterward. Christmas lights glowed softly across quiet suburban streets, while windshield wipers swept freezing rain across the glass in slow, rhythmic motions. Families sat inside warm houses eating dinner, watching television, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, mine had quietly become something else entirely, a negotiation I never agreed to enter. At that moment, I still didn't know how deeply Michael had been pulled into all of this, but I intended to find out before Vanessa reached him first.
I didn't go back inside my house that night. That surprised even me. Instead, I parked beside the lake for almost an hour, with the heater running low while Richard's letter replayed in my mind. If you are reading this, Helen, it means I was right about someone in our family. Not people. Someone. Singular. That detail mattered, because until now, part of me still feared Daniel had become fully involved. But Richard chose his words carefully, always carefully. Eventually, I drove to my sister Carol's condo across town. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. When she opened the door wearing slippers and an old University of Michigan sweatshirt, her expression immediately changed. Helen? What happened? And suddenly I realized how exhausted I looked. Not weak, not fragile, exhausted in the way people look after reality shifts underneath them. I just need somewhere quiet tonight. Carol didn't ask questions immediately. That's why I've always loved her. Good people understand silence first. She simply nodded and stepped aside. You can have the guest room. The condo smelled like cinnamon candles and laundry detergent. Soft jazz played quietly from somewhere near the kitchen. Normal things. Safe things. I nearly cried from relief. Later that night, while Carol slept down the hall, I sat awake beside the guest room window staring at my phone. Michael's contact sat open on the screen. I must have typed and erased messages 20 times. Finally, I wrote, "Can we have breakfast tomorrow? Just us." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Yes, I was actually hoping you'd call. That response kept me awake the rest of the night, because it meant Michael already knew something was wrong. The next morning dawned gray and painfully cold. I met Michael at a small breakfast place near Northwestern University, where he'd been taking graduate business classes at night. Richard used to brag endlessly about that. "He's got your heart and my patience," he'd always say. When Michael walked inside wearing a dark winter coat and knit cap, my chest tightened unexpectedly. He looked so much like Richard at that age. Same eyes, same careful expression. But unlike Daniel recently, Michael hugged me immediately. A real hug. Not distracted, not polite, warm. "You okay, Grandma?" Such a simple question. And somehow it almost broke me. We ordered coffee and pancakes. Neither of us touched much. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the diner windows, while students hurried along sidewalks carrying backpacks and steaming cups of coffee. Normal life moving around us again. Meanwhile, my family quietly fractured beneath the surface. Michael stirred sugar into his coffee slowly. Then he looked directly at me. "Grandpa told me this might happen." My stomach tightened immediately. "What exactly did he tell you?" Michael hesitated, not because he wanted to hide anything, because he was trying to protect people while telling the truth. That reminded me painfully of Richard. "He started talking to me differently after his second round of chemo," Michael said quietly. "At first, I thought he was just worried about you being alone." Alone. Everyone kept using that word lately. Michael continued. "But then he started asking strange questions." "What kind of questions?" He leaned back slowly. "He asked whether Mom ever talked about your house when you weren't around." I closed my eyes briefly. Because yes, she had. Dozens of times. Only now the pattern looked obvious. She said things like, Michael stopped carefully. "Eventually, Grandma won't need all that space." Stuff like that. Eventually. Another word people use before taking something. I stayed quiet, and Michael kept talking. "That's when Grandpa told me to start paying attention, instead of assuming things were harmless." Paying attention. Exactly what I was doing now. The emotional shift inside me felt almost physical at this point. Not grieving widow anymore. Witness. Observer. Strategist. Michael lowered his voice slightly. "Grandpa thought Dad was being influenced." Influenced. Not evil. Not malicious. Influenced. Again, Richard's language stayed restrained even in private. That hurt more somehow, because it showed how hard he tried not to destroy the family while he was alive. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug slowly. "What else did he tell you?"
Michael looked uncomfortable now. Then he reached into his backpack. The movement immediately tightened my chest, because suddenly I realized my grandson didn't just know things. He brought something. A folder. Thin, white, folded at the corners from being handled too often. "I wasn't sure whether to show you this," he admitted quietly. "What is it?" His jaw tightened. "Grandpa asked me to keep copies." Copies. Another hidden protection. Richard really had been preparing quietly for months. Michael slid several papers across the table toward me. At first, I only recognized assisted living brochures, luxury retirement communities, memory care facilities, independent senior transition housing. My stomach dropped slowly. Then I saw handwritten notes in the margins. Vanessa's handwriting. Again. Close enough for weekly monitoring. Potential fast-track placement. Property liquidation timing favorable in spring market. For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't breathe properly, because suddenly this wasn't hypothetical anymore. Not emotional pressure. Planning. Actual planning. Michael watched my face carefully. "I found those in Grandpa's office trash bin months ago," he whispered. Trash bin. Vanessa thought nobody would see them. Richard did. Michael did. And now, I did. I stared at the notes while restaurant noise faded around me. Forks clinking. Coffee machines hissing. People laughing softly in nearby booths. Normal sounds beside completely abnormal betrayal. At that moment, grief finally transformed fully into something colder. Precision. Michael leaned closer. "There's more." Those 3 words again. Always more. Always another layer waiting underneath. I looked up slowly. "What more?" He hesitated, then pulled out his phone.
Grandpa asked me to record something if things escalated after he died. Record something. My pulse slowed immediately. Michael opened a video file, time-stamped 3 months earlier. Richard appeared sitting in his office at home, wearing a navy sweater I bought him for Christmas years ago. He looked thinner, tired, but completely clear-eyed. My breath caught instantly, because suddenly my dead husband was alive again inside my grandson's shaking hands. Michael didn't press play yet. Instead, he looked at me carefully. "Grandma, there's something in this video you really need to hear, before Mom and Dad find out you know." A cold wave moved through my chest, because suddenly I understood this wasn't only about money anymore. Richard had discovered something bigger, something personal, something dangerous enough that he recorded evidence before he died. And then Michael whispered the sentence that changed everything again. Grandpa believed Vanessa wasn't acting alone.
Michael's thumb hovered over the video for several seconds before he pressed play. I didn't realize I had stopped breathing until Richard's face appeared on the screen. The diner around us faded instantly. Coffee machines hissed somewhere near the counter. Students laughed softly 2 booths away. Forks scraped against plates. But none of it felt real anymore, because my husband was suddenly sitting in front of me again. Alive. Tired, yes. Thinner than I remembered, but unmistakably Richard. He adjusted the camera slightly before speaking. "If you're watching this, Helen," he said quietly, then things became worse than I hoped they would. My throat tightened immediately. Even through a phone screen, his voice still carried that same calm steadiness that had anchored our family for decades. Michael stayed silent beside me, respectfully silent. That mattered. Richard continued, "I want you to understand something first. None of this happened quickly." I closed my eyes briefly, because that sentence alone explained everything. The comments, the pressure, the subtle shifts. Manipulation rarely arrives screaming. It arrives smiling, slowly. Richard leaned back carefully in the chair inside his office, the same office where he spent 30 years building Turner Industrial components from a tiny machine shop into a regional manufacturing company. Family photographs lined the shelves behind him. Our wedding picture, Daniel's college graduation, Michael holding a fishing pole at age 10. Looking at those pictures while hearing what came next felt almost unbearable. "I started noticing changes in Vanessa about a year ago," Richard said. Noticing, not accusing. That was exactly like him, measured even now. "I initially believed she was simply anxious about financial security." Michael glanced toward me briefly, because we both knew that explanation no longer fit. Richard continued quietly. "But eventually the conversation stopped sounding like concern and started sounding like positioning." Positioning. Same word my mind had already started using. I wrapped both hands tighter around my coffee mug. The ceramic had gone cold long ago. "She began asking unusually specific questions," Richard said. "Ownership structures, probate timing, medical authority, liquidation schedules." Every phrase sounded painfully familiar now, not because they were shocking anymore, because they formed a recognizable pattern. And patterns are harder to deny than isolated moments. Richard paused in the video, long enough that I could hear him breathing softly. Then he said something that changed everything again. "But Vanessa wasn't the person who worried me most." I looked sharply at Michael. Beside me, he looked equally tense now, because suddenly the story shifted direction. If not Vanessa, then who? On the screen, Richard rubbed his wedding ring slowly, a habit he always had while thinking carefully. "Helen," he said softly, "I believe someone close to Vanessa has been influencing decisions behind the scenes." Influencing. Again, that restrained language. Even while wanting me, Richard refused cruelty. Michael lowered the phone slightly. "I didn't know who he meant at first," he admitted quietly. Neither did I. But then Richard continued. "Her brother, Eric." The name landed like cold water. Eric Lawson, Vanessa's older brother, real estate developer, overly charming, always talking about investments. My stomach tightened immediately, because suddenly dozens of uncomfortable memories resurfaced all at once. Eric wandering through my house commenting on property values. Eric discussing market timing during family dinners. Eric once joking that our neighborhood was wasted on retirees. At the time, Richard barely reacted outwardly, but now I realized something horrifying. He had been watching Eric too. On the screen, Richard leaned forward slightly. Eric became unusually involved in conversations regarding the property after my diagnosis. Michael muted the video briefly and looked at me carefully. "There's more. Always more." That phrase had become its own warning signal now. Michael reached into his backpack again and removed another folded document. This one looked official. Corporate letterhead, financial projections, property evaluations. Across the top corner, I saw Eric Lawson Development Group. My pulse slowed immediately. because suddenly the entire emotional atmosphere shifted from family dysfunction to strategy. I unfolded the papers carefully. Several pages detailed projected redevelopment estimates for residential lots in our neighborhood, my property. Then I saw my address highlighted in yellow. Below it, acquisition pathway potentially simplified through family-assisted transition. Family-assisted transition. Again, the polished language. Never theft, never coercion, just transition. Michael watched me carefully. I found those in Grandpa's office safe after the funeral. Office safe. Richard kept them hidden intentionally, because he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. I looked back at the frozen video frame of my husband on Michael's phone, and for the first time since his death, I stopped seeing him only as someone I lost. Now I saw him as someone who left breadcrumbs behind intentionally. Protection systems, quiet warnings, evidence. Richard hadn't surrendered. He prepared. The emotional shift inside me felt almost surgical now. Grief still existed, but strategy had entered beside it. I unfolded another page. This one included estimated resale timing after occupancy transition. Occupancy transition, meaning me, my removal. Michael spoke softly. Grandpa believed Eric convinced Mom the property was more valuable redeveloped than preserved. Redeveloped. Such a cold word for a family home. I thought about the maple tree Richard planted, Daniel carving his initials into the garage wall at age 12, Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, 42 years of life reduced to redevelopment projections. That realization didn't make me emotional anymore. It made me precise. At that moment, I understood exactly why Richard protected the trust structure before he died. Not because he distrusted everyone completely, but because he saw greed slowly reorganizing relationships around money. Michael pressed play again. On screen, Richard looked directly into the camera. "If Daniel is involved," he said carefully, "I do not believe he understands the full situation." I exhaled slowly, because deep down I had hoped Richard saw the same thing I did. Daniel wasn't leading this, he was drifting. Weakness can become dangerous inside manipulative environments. Richard continued, "But weakness still causes damage." That sentence hit harder than anger would have, because it was true. Silence causes damage too. I thought about Daniel avoiding eye contact during the will reading, the way he stayed quiet while Vanessa called me a burden. Maybe he wasn't orchestrating everything, but he was allowing it, and sometimes that distinction stops mattering. On the screen, Richard's expression changed slightly, more serious now. "If things escalate after my death, Martin has instructions to delay certain disclosures until specific conditions are met." Specific conditions. Michael paused the video again. He wouldn't explain that part to me. I stared at the screen, because suddenly another realization emerged quietly beneath everything else. Richard built layers, multiple layers, legal protections, separate instructions, hidden beneficiaries, video evidence, which meant he anticipated resistance after his death, possibly confrontation, maybe even betrayal worse than what I already knew. The waitress refilled our coffee silently. Neither of us thanked her immediately. We were too deep inside the gravity of Richard's words. Outside the diner windows, snow continued falling steadily across the parking lot. Soft, quiet, almost peaceful. Nothing about my life felt peaceful anymore. Michael leaned closer. "There's one more thing, Grandma." The tension in his voice changed instantly. Different now. Not emotional. Nervous. That made my stomach tighten. "What is it?" He hesitated, then unlocked his phone again. This time not the video. A voicemail recording, time-stamped 4 days after Richard's funeral. "Mom doesn't know I kept this," Michael admitted. The recording began with static, then Vanessa's voice, sharp, controlled. "We need Helen moved before Martin finishes the secondary review." My blood turned cold instantly. Not eventually, not someday. Moved, before review completion. Urgency, deadlines, planning. Then another voice answered, male, confident, Eric. "If the trust activates fully, we lose leverage," he said calmly. Leverage. I closed my eyes briefly, because suddenly this wasn't only about greed anymore. It was coordinated, strategic. Vanessa spoke again. "Daniel's becoming hesitant." Eric laughed softly. "Then keep emotional pressure on him." Pressure. Again that word. Every road led back to pressure. Michael stopped the recording halfway through. "There's more after that," he whispered. "But I thought maybe you should breathe first." Breathe. Interesting suggestion, because I realized I hadn't taken a full breath since Richard's face appeared on the screen. I looked out the diner window slowly. Snow covering parked cars. College students crossing streets bundled in scarves. Ordinary life continuing. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law and her brother had apparently been coordinating pressure campaigns around my husband's estate before he was even buried. And suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. That surprised me most. The fear was gone. What replaced it felt colder, focused. Michael studied me carefully. "You okay?" I looked back at my grandson. Richard trusted him for a reason. And for the first time since all this started,
I trusted my own instincts completely too. No, I answered honestly. Then I folded the property papers neatly and slid them back into the folder. But I'm paying attention now. Michael nodded slowly, and then he said something that changed the direction of everything again. Grandpa scheduled one final family dinner before he died. I frowned slightly. What dinner? He planned it weeks in advance with Martin. A cold feeling moved through my chest, because suddenly another hidden layer appeared. What was it for? Michael looked directly at me. The public reading of the final trust conditions. Public, not private. Richard intended witnesses, structure, exposure. Michael lowered his voice further. And according to Grandpa, everyone has to be there. The diner suddenly felt very small around us, because I finally understood what Richard had truly been building toward all along. Not quiet protection, a controlled confrontation. And then Michael handed me one final folded document. At the top, in Richard's handwriting, were 6 words that made my pulse stop cold. Family attendance mandatory before distribution. The words family attendance mandatory before distribution stayed in my mind long after Michael and I left the diner.
Richard planned this, not emotionally, not impulsively, carefully, like a final business negotiation disguised as a family dinner. Snow drifted softly across the parking lot while Michael drove me back toward Carol's condo. Christmas lights blurred through the windshield as passing cars sprayed slush against the road. Neither of us spoke much at first. Some silences carry fear, others carry preparation. This one carried both. Finally, Michael glanced toward me briefly. "You're thinking exactly what Grandpa thought you would." I looked over slowly. "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "Quiet means you're planning." That almost made me laugh. Because Richard used to say the same thing. When Helen gets quiet, he'd joke, someone should probably start worrying. For the first time in weeks, the memory didn't break me. It steadied me. At that moment, I realized grief had changed shape again. Not gone, never gone, but organized now, directed. I spent the next morning at Carol's dining room table reviewing every document Michael brought me. Trust amendments, property projections, copies of assisted living brochures, Eric Lawson's redevelopment estimates. The deeper I looked, the more obvious the pattern became. Not chaotic greed, structured pressure. Every document framed the same narrative carefully. Helen is overwhelmed. Helen needs support. Helen should transition. Nobody ever wrote, Helen should lose control, but every page quietly led there anyway. That's how manipulation works inside respectable families. Nobody says the ugly thing directly. They create paperwork that slowly says it for them. Carol brought coffee into the dining room around noon and stopped short when she saw the documents spread across the table. "What is all this?" I looked up calmly. My family preparing to erase me politely. She stared at me for several seconds, then sat down slowly. "Jesus, Helen." I didn't cry. That surprised her. It surprised me too, because somewhere during the last 48 hours, emotional survival had transformed into strategic clarity. And clarity can feel colder than anger. Around 1 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. Martin Green. I let it ring twice before answering. "Helen." His voice sounded exhausted, like a man carrying too much loyalty in too many directions. "I think we need to meet privately." Again that word, privately. It had become the unofficial language of this entire situation. We agreed to meet at his office after business hours, not during the day, not where staff might overhear. That alone told me things were escalating. Before leaving Carol's condo, I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. Gray sweater, minimal makeup, pearl earrings Richard bought me for our 30th anniversary. I looked older than I did a month ago, but not weak, not anymore. Martin's office felt different at night, quieter, more vulnerable somehow. Downtown Chicago glowed outside the windows, while the receptionist's desk sat dark and empty under soft overhead lighting. Martin greeted me personally near the elevators. No assistant, no formalities, just tension. He closed the conference room door carefully behind us, then immediately said something that changed the emotional temperature again. "Vanessa knows someone's talking." I sat very still. "How?" "She's becoming aggressive." Aggressive. Interesting choice of word from a lawyer who usually softened everything. Martin loosened his tie slightly before sitting across from me. "She contacted me 3 times today." "About what?" "You." "Of course. Always me. But no longer as a grieving widow.
now as an obstacle. Martin slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I think Richard intended you to see these only if things reached this point. Reached this point. Meaning confrontation was no longer theoretical. I opened the folder slowly. Inside sat copies of handwritten meeting notes. Not Martin's handwriting, Richard's. Dates stretched across almost 8 months. Beside each date were observations. Vanessa pushing accelerated asset discussions again. Eric increasingly involved, despite no family authority. Daniel passive, avoiding conflict. Then one line near the bottom stopped me cold. Helen still believes everyone means well. My throat tightened immediately, because that sounded exactly like Richard, protective even while frustrated. I looked up slowly. Why didn't he tell me directly? Martin's expression softened painfully. Because he was terrified of destroying the family before he died. That answer hurt more than betrayal itself, because suddenly I understood the impossible position Richard lived inside during his final months. Dying slowly, watching manipulation grow around him, trying to protect me without shattering our son emotionally before he was gone. That kind of restraint cost people pieces of themselves. Martin folded his hands together carefully. He hoped he was wrong. Another painful truth. Richard wasn't hunting enemies. He was searching desperately for reasons not to believe what he already saw. I stared out the window toward the city lights below. Cars moving, people living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my husband had quietly built an emotional emergency system around me before dying. The loneliness of that realization settled heavily into my chest. Martin leaned forward slightly. Helen, there's another issue. Every conversation lately seemed layered with trapdoors. What now? He hesitated. Then, Eric's financial situation. Immediately my instincts sharpened. What about it? Martin opened another document. Commercial debt summaries, property leverage reports, delayed development loans, several marked urgent. I scanned the numbers silently, then looked back up. He's drowning. Martin nodded slowly. Richard discovered Eric's company has severe liquidity problems. Everything suddenly aligned. Not just greed, desperation. That changes people faster. He saw your property as a solution, Martin said quietly. My property. My home. 42 years reduced to liquidity. I stayed silent long enough that Martin finally asked, How are you this calm? Interesting question. Because I wondered the same thing myself. Finally, I answered honestly. I think the shock wore out. And that was true. Eventually, betrayal becomes too organized to remain emotional every second. At some point, you either collapse, or you start observing. I chose observation.
Martin studied me carefully, then lowered his voice. The family dinner is tomorrow night. There it was, the confrontation Richard planned, the gathering he structured before entering hospice. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. Who's attending? Everyone. That single word carried enormous weight. Daniel, Vanessa, Eric, Michael, Martin, me. Witnesses, pressure, exposure. Richard designed this intentionally. Martin slid one final sealed envelope across the table, thicker than the others. This contains the final trust conditions. I stared at it without touching it. Can I open it? Martin shook his head immediately. Not yet. Why? Because Richard gave specific instructions. Of course he did. Even now, my husband was controlling the timing carefully. Martin's expression tightened. The envelope can only be opened during the dinner once all parties are present. Public structure again. Richard wanted everyone cornered by truth simultaneously. No private narrative control. No manipulation afterward. No rewritten versions of events. Smart. Very smart. And suddenly I understood something else. Richard never intended quiet inheritance. He intended accountability. My phone buzzed against the conference table suddenly. Vanessa. Martin glanced toward the screen immediately. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she called again. And again. 3 calls in less than 2 minutes. Aggressive. Panicked. Losing control. I finally answered. Helen. No greeting. No warmth. Just immediate pressure. Where are you? Interesting. Not, how are you? Not, can we talk? Just, where are you? I'm out. With who? That question told me everything. She was tracking information now. Containment mode. I looked calmly at Martin across the table, then answered softly. Why does that matter? Silence. Tiny. Dangerous. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice sounded overly controlled. We're having dinner tomorrow night.
Not asking, informing. I know. Another pause. Then she said something that finally confirmed she understood her position was weakening. Michael's confused about a lot of things right now. Confused, meaning manageable, influenceable. I looked toward the sealed envelope resting between Martin and me, then answered carefully. I don't think Michael is confused anymore. Silence again. Longer this time. When she finally spoke, the warmth was completely gone from her voice. You should be careful who you trust. Then she hung up. I stared at the dock phone screen for several seconds, because manipulators always reveal themselves most clearly once control begins slipping. Martin exhaled slowly. She's scared. No, I answered quietly. I looked down at Richard's sealed trust envelope, then out toward the city lights beyond the conference room windows. She's cornered. And there's a difference.
The next afternoon, snow covered the suburbs in a clean white layer that made everything look deceptively peaceful. I returned home for the first time since overhearing the kitchen conversation. The house smelled faintly like cedarwood and old coffee. Richard's coat still hung beside the front closet. His slipper still rested near the bedroom doorway upstairs. Nothing inside the house had changed, except me. I moved through each room slowly, observing now instead of grieving. That emotional shift felt almost frightening in its own way. On the kitchen island sat a handwritten note, Daniel's handwriting. Mom, can we talk before tonight, please? Please. That word carried more honesty than anything he'd said in weeks. At that moment, I realized Daniel was beginning to break away from Vanessa emotionally. Not fully, not yet, but enough to become dangerous to her. I folded the note quietly and slipped it into my purse. Then I noticed something else beside the coffee maker. A manila folder. Not mine. Partially hidden beneath a real estate brochure. My pulse slowed immediately. Because instinct had finally become sharper than emotion. I opened the folder carefully. Inside sat printed emails. Between Vanessa, Eric, and someone else. A private elder transition consultant. The subject line on the most recent message made my entire body go cold. Recommended timeline for Helen Turner relocation before trust activation. And underneath it, I saw tonight's date. The subject line stared back at me from the printed email like something cold and surgical. Recommended timeline for Helen Turner relocation before trust activation. Tonight's date sat directly beneath it. Tonight. Not eventually. Not hypothetically. Planned. Scheduled. I stood motionless beside the kitchen island while snow drifted softly outside the windows. The house looked exactly the same. Richard's coffee mug still beside the sink. The old clock ticking near the hallway. The faint smell of cedarwood from the fireplace. But suddenly, everything inside those walls felt rearranged. Not physically, emotionally. Because this was no longer suspicion. No longer instinct. It was documented intent. I opened the rest of the folder slowly. Email chains. Property timelines. Conversations between Vanessa, Eric, and the elder transition consultant. Every message sounded polite, professional, careful. That almost made it worse. Transition support. Emotional adjustment planning. Family-assisted relocation. Language designed to sound compassionate while removing someone from their own life. My life. At the bottom of one page, I saw Eric's response, timestamped just 3 days after Richard's funeral. The sooner Helen loses decision confidence, the smoother this becomes. Decision confidence. I closed the folder immediately. Not from weakness, from clarity. Because at that exact moment, any remaining confusion inside me disappeared completely. This was never about helping me. It was about moving me, controlling me, positioning me between grief and paperwork until I became manageable. And suddenly, I felt calm. Not peaceful, but calm in the way people become calm once truth finally stops shifting shape. The doorbell rang at 6:30. Daniel. I knew it before opening the door. He stood on the porch wearing a dark wool coat dusted with snow. His face looked exhausted, older somehow, like the last few days had finally caught up to him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked past me into the house. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside quietly. The kitchen lights glowed softly against the snow-dark evening outside, while Daniel removed his coat slowly near the doorway. He looked around the room carefully, almost nervously, like he suddenly understood this house carried history heavier than furniture. "I've been trying to call you." "I know." Silence settled between us. The refrigerator hummed softly. Somewhere upstairs, old pipes clicked in the walls. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "Mom, what's happening?" Interesting question. Not what did Vanessa say, not what are you accusing us of, just what's happening. That meant he already knew enough to feel afraid. I studied my son quietly. The little boy Richard taught to ride a bike in our driveway. The teenager who cried when our golden retriever died. The grown man who stopped protecting me one compromise at a time. Then I asked softly, "Do you really want the truth?" His jaw tightened immediately. That answer told me enough. I walked toward the kitchen island and placed the folder gently in front of him. "Read." Daniel frowned slightly before opening it. At first, confusion, then recognition, then horror. I watched every emotional shift happen across my son's face in complete silence. The emails, the timelines, the relocation planning, Eric's messages, Vanessa's notes. Each page pulled him further into reality. At one point he whispered, "Oh my God." Not performative, not defensive, real. That mattered. He kept reading, and suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Daniel truly did not understand how far Vanessa and Eric had gone. Weakness made him complicit, but manipulation kept him partially blind too. Eventually, he lowered the paper slowly onto the counter. "She told me this was about protecting you." There it was. The emotional center of manipulation. Protection language. Control disguised as care. I leaned against the counter quietly. "Did you believe her?" Daniel looked down immediately. That silence answered everything. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. "I think I wanted to." That hurt more than anger would have, because it was honest. Painfully honest. The front door opened 30 minutes later without knocking. Vanessa. Of course. She entered carrying cold air and tension with her. The moment she saw Daniel standing beside me in the kitchen, her expression shifted instantly. Not surprise. Calculation. "How long have you been here?" She asked him carefully. Interesting. Not "is everything okay?" Not "what happened?" Always assessment first. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her differently than before. Longer. More carefully. That subtle shift changed the emotional atmosphere instantly. Vanessa felt it too. I could tell. She removed her gloves slowly. "We should leave soon. Everyone's expecting us." Everyone. The dinner. Richard's final structure. Daniel slid the folder across the counter toward her. "I found this." For the first time since I met Vanessa 15 years ago, she lost composure visibly. Only for a second. But enough. Her eyes widened before the control returned. "Where did you get this?" Not denial. Not confusion. That mattered. Daniel stared at her. "You planned all this." Vanessa exhaled sharply. "Daniel, lower your voice." Again. Control first. Always control. "You told me your mother needed support." He continued quietly. "You never said." "She does need support." Vanessa cut him off immediately. "She's grieving. She's isolated. She's vulnerable." I stayed silent. And somehow that silence unsettled her more than arguments would have. Daniel shook his head slowly. "This says relocation before trust activation." Vanessa's posture tightened. "Because your father complicated everything at the last second." There it was again. Not grief. Not sadness. Frustration. Because Richard disrupted the outcome she expected. I watched her carefully now. Really carefully.
And suddenly I noticed something strange. Vanessa looked less confident than angry, which meant she no longer controlled the narrative completely. That changed everything.
At 7:30, we arrived at the restaurant Richard selected before entering hospice. Private dining room, old Chicago steakhouse downtown. Dark wood walls, soft amber lighting, snow falling quietly outside tall windows overlooking the river. Richard loved this place. We celebrated our 40th anniversary here. Now it felt like a courtroom disguised as dinner. Eric was already waiting inside when we arrived. Expensive coat, perfect smile. The kind of man who always looked comfortable near money, until he saw me. Then his expression flickered slightly. Tiny, fast, fear. Interesting. Michael arrived moments later beside Martin Green. Unlike everyone else, Michael walked directly toward me first. "You okay, Grandma?" Again, that question. Simple, human, real. I touched his arm softly. "I am now." Vanessa watched that interaction carefully. I noticed, and so did Martin. Everyone sat eventually. Nobody touched the wine. Nobody looked relaxed. Outside, snow continued falling against the city lights while waiters moved quietly through the restaurant carrying trays of expensive food nobody cared about anymore. The tension at that table felt almost architectural, built carefully over years, now finally visible. Martin placed Richard's sealed envelope in the center of the table. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Eric smiled tightly. "Well, I assume Richard planned some dramatic reveal. Interesting again. Not grief, not loss, just irritation." Martin looked directly at him. Richard planned accountability. The room went still immediately. Daniel stared down at his folded hands. Vanessa sat unnaturally straight beside him. And suddenly I realized something powerful. I was no longer the weakest person at this table. Martin opened the envelope slowly. Paper sliding against paper sounded strangely loud in the quiet room. Then he began reading. Final trust conditions of Richard A. Turner. Professional tone. Measured. Controlled. Exactly the way Richard would have wanted. Several standard clauses came first. Investment distributions. Property management structures. Business succession timelines. Eric relaxed slightly during those parts. Big mistake. Because Richard always layered important things carefully. Then Martin turned another page, and the room changed. Conditional inheritance suspension shall activate immediately upon verified evidence of coercion, manipulation, or involuntary relocation pressure directed toward Helen Turner. Vanessa's breathing shifted beside Daniel, subtle, faster. Martin continued. Such evidence may include written communication, financial coordination, property transition planning, or third-party consultation regarding Helen Turner's residential displacement. Eric's face lost color first, because suddenly he understood. Evidence already existed. Daniel slowly looked toward Vanessa, not confused anymore. Awake. Martin placed several printed emails onto the table, the same ones I found earlier. No dramatic gestures, no raised voices, just documents. Reality becomes devastating when written down quietly. Eric leaned forward sharply. These are being taken out of context. Martin ignored him. More documents followed. The assisted living timelines, the redevelopment estimates, the consultant communications. Every polished sentence suddenly sounded monstrous once read aloud together. Vanessa finally spoke. This was about safety. Martin looked directly at her. Then why discuss property liquidation timing before Helen consented to anything? Silence. Heavy silence. Daniel stared at the table like something inside him was collapsing in slow motion. Eric attempted recovery next. Richard was sick. He misunderstood strategic planning discussions. Then Michael spoke for the first time. Calmly. Precisely. No. Grandpa documented everything. Every head turned toward him. Michael placed his phone gently onto the table. Then pressed play. Richard's recorded voice filled the private dining room softly. If pressure increases after my death, it will likely happen gradually and under the language of concern. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed normally. Richard continued. The danger is not open cruelty. It is coordinated reassurance. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Because suddenly the room no longer belonged to her narrative. It belonged to Richard's. And Richard came prepared. The video continued. I want Helen protected from emotional exhaustion, disguised as assistance. Daniel looked physically ill now, because his father wasn't attacking him. He was describing him. Passive. Influenced. Absent when protection mattered most. Then Richard said the sentence that finally shattered the room completely. If Daniel remains silent while Helen is pressured, his inheritance access shall be permanently reduced. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Martin quietly slid another amendment across the table. Signed, notarized, legal, real. Vanessa stood abruptly. This is insane. But her voice no longer carried authority, only panic. Eric started talking rapidly about legal interpretation and emotional context and family stress. Nobody listened anymore, because once manipulation becomes visible, it loses elegance instantly. I remained completely silent through all of it. That silence became its own kind of power. Eventually, Daniel looked at me, actually looked at me for the first time in weeks. Tears filled his eyes slowly.
I'm sorry. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just broken. And somehow that hurt more than everything else combined, because my son finally understood what his silence cost. I nodded once, nothing more. That was enough. Martin opened the final page of Richard's trust conditions carefully, then read the last clause aloud. In the event Helen Turner faces coordinated displacement pressure following my death, full residential authority and protected controlling interests shall transfer immediately to Helen Turner exclusively. Exclusively. Not shared, not supervised. Mine. Completely mine. Martin closed the folder quietly. It's already legally active. The room fell silent again. Outside, snow covered the city in soft white layers while warm restaurant light reflected against the windows. Inside, everything had changed permanently. Eric stood first, angry now, cornered. This family is destroying itself over paranoia. I finally spoke then. My voice stayed calm. No, Eric. Every eye turned toward me. I folded my napkin carefully beside my untouched dinner plate, then looked directly at Vanessa. It was already being destroyed. Richard just refused to let me disappear quietly while it happened. Silence. Pure silence. Vanessa looked away first. That mattered too. Daniel covered his face briefly with one hand. Michael stayed beside me, solid, steady, like Richard knew he would be. I stood slowly from the table and picked up my purse. Nobody tried stopping me, not even Vanessa, because for the first time, everyone understood the balance of power had shifted completely. I looked once more around the table. My grieving son, my frightened daughter-in-law, Eric staring at legal documents like they personally betrayed him, Michael watching me with quiet pride, and Martin Green finally looking relieved. Then I smiled softly, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just peacefully. I was never the burden, I said quietly. Then I walked out of the restaurant into the falling snow, with my dignity intact, and my husband's final protection wrapped around me like one last act of love.